I stood before the door of the luxurious penthouse in downtown Denver, gripping tightly the key my daughter had no idea I possessed. Inside, Julia was sobbing, her voice trembling like a lost child. "Scott, you have to help me!" Mom isn't answering her phone. I don't know what to do anymore. I peered through the small gap in the half-open door. My daughter, the same one who 6 months ago had sold the family's Aspen vacation home and her father's beloved GMC Sierra, was now crying in the arms of the very man I had never trusted. Scott raised an eyebrow, his tone cold. "You should call your mother, Julia." "I can't take care of you forever," Julia sniffled, weeping. "But Mom must hate me by now. I sold the family house without asking anyone." I stood there listening quietly to every sob of my child. Part of me wanted to knock, hold her in my arms, and whisper, "I'm here, honey. Everything will be all right." But I didn't. Instead, I turned away, stepped into the elevator, and pressed the button for the lobby. Because there was something Julia didn't know. Something that made me ache, burn with anger, and yet, in a bitter way, laugh at the irony. The penthouse where she was crying, this 22-story building, every brick, every pane of glass, all of it belonged to me. And the cruel twist was that she had just paid rent to her own mother without realizing it. But to understand why I stood outside that door, listening to my daughter cry without stepping in, you need to hear the story from the beginning, the story of the man I loved, the daughter I once devoted my life to, and the lesson that sometimes only pain can teach. My name is Veronica Adams. I'm 72 years old, and this is the story of how I let my daughter lose everything so that she could finally find herself again. 9 months earlier. That morning, Leonard woke up early as usual. He made my coffee exactly the way I liked it, a spoonful of sugar and a dash of cream. He kissed my forehead softly and murmured, "Good morning, my love." We sat by the wooden table he had built with his own hands 40 years ago, gazing out at the snow-covered Rockies through the window. Leonard told me about a dream he had, about our first trip to Aspen when Julia was 10. He laughed, remembering how she had face-planted into the snow the first time she tried to ski, then stood right back up, brushed herself off, and climbed up the hill again. "Remember that?" She cried her eyes out, but 5 minutes later she was back at it. He said, eyes glowing with pride, and those were the last words I ever heard from him. In the middle of his story, Leonard suddenly went silent. He set his coffee down, clutching his chest. He looked at me, those blue eyes I had loved for 45 years, now filled with fear. Veronica. Then he collapsed. I didn't get to say goodbye. Didn't get to tell him he was my whole world. All I could do was call 911, hold him tight, and feel his body grow cold in my arms. "Heart attack," the doctor said. He didn't make it, but I knew. Leonard had pushed himself too long. 40 years of driving buses, working double shifts, investing every penny for our future without ever once complaining. And now he was gone, leaving me with a house so silent it hurt, a pickup truck no one washed on Sundays anymore, and a daughter I was about to face the most painful truth about. In the first months after Leonard's death, Julia visited often, 3 times a week, as punctual as a clock. She brought food, helped me clean, spoke tenderly. "Mom, you need to take better care of yourself. You've lost so much weight. Mom, let me schedule a full checkup for you. You're living alone now. You need to stay healthy. Mom, I handled Dad's funeral expenses. You just rest, okay?" I thought that was love. I believed my daughter genuinely cared. But looking back now, I see the signs I should have noticed earlier. The way Julia's eyes wandered around the house, counting every item. The way she asked about savings accounts and Leonard's life insurance. The way Scott, her deceitful husband, often found excuses to stop by, surveying the place with the eyes of an appraiser. "This house is too big for one person, Aunt Veronica," Scott once said casually. Must cost a lot to maintain, huh? I just smiled and poured him more tea. But inside, I began to see his true face, and worse, I saw my daughter slowly changing under his influence. Julia, the little girl who once helped me cook, who used to cry at the sight of a homeless person, now only talked about money, travel, and fancy places she wanted to go. I tried to believe it was just a phase, until that morning, in the doctor's waiting room, my phone rang. "Mom, Scott and I are going to Europe tomorrow. I sold the Aspen house and Dad's GMC Sierra. We needed the money." Bye, click. The call ended. No apology, no explanation, just a cold statement and silence. I sat there on the blue plastic chair among coughing patients, and for the first time since Leonard's death, I didn't cry. Instead, a strange calm washed over me, because at that moment, I remembered something Leonard had prepared before he passed, the yellow envelope, the one he had handed me 3 days before he died. "Veronica, keep this in the drawer. If anything happens to me, open it, but only when you're truly ready." Amid the grief and chaos of the funeral, I had forgotten all about it. But now, when my daughter had just sold away every piece of our family's memories, the house, the truck, and my trust, I knew it was time to open it. The nurse called my name. I stood up, smiling faintly, because for the first time in 6 months, I felt Leonard was still somewhere nearby, protecting me, protecting us both, even from beyond. If you've ever lost faith in the person closest to you, would you dare face them, with silence instead of anger? Share your thoughts in the comments, because every story you write might touch another heart. And if you want to follow my journey of restoring justice through love, hit subscribe, because the next chapter will make you ask yourself, can love still save someone after they've betrayed you? The doctor finished the checkup, looked at me with a gentle gaze, and said, "Mrs. Adams, your health is very good for your age. Just rest more, eat well, and keep a relaxed spirit." I nodded to thank him, but my mind was somewhere else entirely, in the empty house waiting for me, and in the drawer that held the yellow envelope I had never dared to open. I took the bus home. Yes, the bus. Because Julia had sold the GMC Sierra Leonard had spent 20 years paying off, the truck he washed every Sunday, rain or shine. I sat by the window seat, watching Denver pass by. The high-rises, the hurried people, each with their own life, their own story. And I wondered, how many of them carry in their hearts the same feeling of betrayal as I do? How many once believed family love was something you could never lose until it truly vanished? The woman next to me clutched her grocery bag, her face tired after a long day's work. The man behind me was talking on the phone to his child, his voice soft. "Dad's coming home soon, kiddo. Tonight, I'll take you for ice cream, okay?" Hearing that made my chest tighten. Love, family, things I once thought eternal, until this morning. The bus stopped near my house. I got off and walked 2 more blocks. The 2-story Victorian house Leonard and I bought more than 40 years ago still stood there, proud, worn, but familiar. Back then, we had nothing but love and a huge bank loan. I remember the first day I stepped into this house clearly. Leonard carried me over the threshold, grinning from ear to ear. "Welcome home, my wife." Julia was 2 then, clapping in his arms, laughing gaily. Now the house remained, but Leonard was gone, and Julia had chosen a different path. I opened the door. The house was pitch dark, the silence so complete I could hear the clock ticking. No more Leonard's footsteps on the wooden stairs. No more his voice calling from the kitchen. "You home?" "And I'm cooking dinner." Only silence. Dense. Heavy. I turned on the living room light, then went upstairs. Each stair creaked beneath my feet, a familiar sound, at once comforting and painful. I entered the bedroom. The room Leonard and I had shared for over 4 decades. The bed was still unmade from the morning. His pillow still bore the imprint of his head. I reached out and touched it, clinging to the fragile hope that some warmth of him remained. But there was none. Everything had gone cold. I opened the dresser drawer. Beneath the wool scarf my mother had knitted for me when I was a girl, the yellow envelope lay quietly. My name was written in the familiar handwriting, Leonard's neat, handsome script, like everything he did. Veronica Adams, open when you are ready. My hand trembled as I held the envelope. It was thicker than I expected, surely more than just a letter inside. I sat on the bed, placed the envelope on my lap, and for a moment hesitated. Was I ready? Was this the right time? Then I recalled Julia's cold voice from this morning. We needed the money. Not, I'm sorry, Mom. Not, Mom, I know this must be hard for you. Just, we needed the money. I tore the envelope open. Inside was a world I hadn't expected. A handwritten letter, a stack of legal documents, deeds for properties, bank statements, and a small key attached to a slip of paper bearing the line, Mountain View Trust, Safe Deposit Box Number. 247, I opened the letter. Leonard's handwriting danced before my eyes through the tears. My beloved Veronica, if you are reading this, it means I have left you alone. I'm sorry, my love. I promised to live to 100 with you, but perhaps my body would not allow it. There are things I never told you, not because I wanted to hide them, but because I wanted to protect you from worry. You have worried so much. For me, for Julia, for the family. Now it's my turn to worry for you. Do you remember the 40 years I drove the bus? You always said, you work so hard, but what you don't know is, I didn't just drive the bus. With each paycheck, I only brought home enough for us to live on. The rest, I invested. I looked up, swallowed my tears, and read on. I started with a small apartment, then 2, then a building. I worked with Marcus Lee, the lawyer friend you once met. Marcus helped me set up a company called Summit Ridge Capital. It sounds grand, but in truth it was simply a holding company to conceal assets. Why did I do this? Because I understood. People change when they know about money. I wanted Julia to love us for who we are, not for what we have. I wanted you to live without worrying about money, but also without letting money change you. Now I want you to know the truth. You are not poor, Veronica. You have never been poor. I had to stop. Wipe my tears. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the paper. In this envelope you will find deeds to 7 properties in Denver and its suburbs, including the Elevation Building, 22 stories in downtown Denver. The Aspen vacation home, don't worry, Julia cannot sell it. It is owned by the company and only you have the authority to decide. Shares in 3 companies, a real estate developer, a restaurant chain, and a tech startup. A bank account at Mountain View Trust with, you should sit down, $4.2 million. I know you will be shocked. Know you will be angry that I hid this from you. But I need you to understand. Everything I did was out of love for you. And one last thing, about Julia. Do not rush to tell her about these things. Watch her. See how she loves you when she thinks you have nothing left. If she still stays with you, trust her. But if she only cares about money, then you must teach her a lesson that only you can teach. Do not spoil our child, Veronica. Love must sometimes be firm. I love you forever. Leonard. I sat there, the letter in my hands, tears falling without end. But this time I did not cry from grief. I cried from gratitude, for Leonard's love, for his wisdom and his mercy. He had known. Even before he left, he knew Julia would change. And he had left me everything, not just assets, but a mission. I turned to the next stack of papers. Each page was another shock. The deed to the Elevation Building, yes. The building Julia and Scott were renting the penthouse in, paying rent unknowingly to me. The Mountain View Trust bank statement, $4,000,000 $287,459. I counted twice because I could not believe my eyes. Leonard, the bus driver, the man who always wore a worn collar shirt, the one who fixed everything with his calloused hands, had quietly made us millionaires. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. In the end, I did both. I stepped out onto the balcony, still holding the letter. Denver's night was silent, distant lights casting a purple-black sky. I looked up and, for a moment, imagined Leonard smiling somewhere among the stars. You were right, Leonard. But this time, I will follow your way to the end. A cold wind blew, carrying the scent of the first snow. A new chapter was beginning. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay looking at the ceiling, my mind spinning. Julia had sold the Aspen house. She said so. But how could she sell it when it wasn't in her name? I turned on the light and went through the papers again. Then I understood. Julia hadn't sold the house. She sold everything inside it. The oak dining set, the antique bed, the paintings, the porcelain dinnerware my mother left behind. Everything. Julia had listed online as secondhand junk. And the GMC Sierra? Julia had deceived me. She sold that truck to someone in Colorado Springs for $8,000. The truck Leonard bought for $35,000, cared for over 2 decades. How much she left me? $5,000. $5,000 for a lifetime of memories. I sat in the dark and felt fury creeping up from my chest. But mixed with that anger was a deep sorrow. The pain of a mother realizing her daughter has become a stranger. I remembered little Julia, the child who once cried when a classmate was bullied, who saved up money to buy me birthday presents. She once said, "Mom, I don't need a lot of money. I just need you and Dad." That girl disappeared once Scott Preston entered her life. Scott, the dapper man, soft-spoken, wearing expensive suits and driving a gleaming sports car. He told Julia she deserved a luxurious life, that she was born to be a princess. And Julia, the girl who always longed for recognition, believed him. Leonard told me 2 years before he died, "Veronica, she's changing. I don't like Scott. There's something, off about him." I had laughed and said, "You worry too much. Julia is grown. She knows what she's doing." But Leonard was right. He was always right. I made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, the spot where Leonard had his last breakfast. I touched the tabletop where he used to place the paper and his coffee cup. "You were right, Leonard," I whispered. "Our child needs to be taught a lesson. But I don't know if I am strong enough." Then, as if Leonard answered, old memories flooded back. Julia at 8. She lied that she had done her homework but actually went out playing with friends. I was about to let it go, but Leonard stopped me. "No, my love. If we let it slide, she will think she can lie forever. Love must sometimes be strict." He punished Julia with a week without TV. She cried and begged. I almost relented, but Leonard was firm. A week later, Julia came to apologize and promised never to lie again. That was Leonard, a father who loved with his heart but taught with his mind. I sat there until dawn. When the first light of a new day crept through the window, shining on the distant Rocky Mountains, I had made my decision. I would not tell Julia about the money or about Leonard's legacy. Not yet. I would let her live with the consequences of her choices. I would let her relearn the true values of life. And if Julia truly was Leonard Adams's daughter, the daughter of the bus driver and the woman who worked 3 jobs to raise the family, she would find her way back. If not, at least I had tried. At least I had taught her the final lesson about real love. I finished the cold cup of tea, stood up, and changed my clothes, because today, the first day of the plan Leonard had begun, I would be the one to complete it. While I sat in the Denver kitchen reading Leonard's letter over and over, Julia and Scott were on a flight to Paris. I didn't know that at the time. Later, when Julia told me, I understood. Her descent began the very moment the plane took off. Champagne, baby? Scott waved down the flight attendant, grinning smugly. We're flying business class. We've got to enjoy it. Julia said she felt a twinge of unease then. Business class tickets to Paris for two were nearly $8,000. But Scott kept saying, "Don't worry, sweetheart. It's money. Money's meant to be spent, right?" They carried $45,000 from selling the Aspen house's contents and the GMC Sierra. Scott said they would travel Europe for 3 months, live it up, then come back and start their own company. "I've got a plan," he said. "Trust me." But Julia didn't know Scott owed $30,000 in gambling debts. She didn't know he had 2 credit cards blocked. She didn't know the real reason he wanted to go to Europe was to dodge debt collectors in Denver. The flight lasted 10 hours. Scott downed 5 glasses of champagne and dozed off, while Julia stared out the window, watching white clouds slip away beneath them and thinking of me. She said she picked up her phone several times, wanting to text, "Mom, I'm sorry." But each time, Scott would stir, kiss her cheek, and whisper, "What are you thinking about? Don't feel guilty. She'll be fine." And Julia believed him, because she wanted to believe. Because if she didn't, she would have to face the truth of what she had just done to her widowed, lonely mother. The first week in Paris was like a dream. They rented a tiny studio in Montmartre. The artist's quarter, cobblestone streets, a cafe on every corner. Scott paid €2,000 for 3 weeks. "Expensive, sure, but we deserve it," he said. They ate breakfast at famed bakeries, drank wine at lunch and dinner. They climbed the Eiffel Tower, took a boat on the Seine, snapped hundreds of photos for Instagram. Julia tagged them. #LivingMyBestLife, #Parisian Dreams, #BlessedLife. Each photo drew hundreds of likes. Friends commented, "You go, girl! Living the dream! So jealous!" No one knew that every meal, every glass of wine, every tour was eating away at what they had left. No one knew that each night Julia counted in her head, still 38,000, then 35,000, then 32,000. Scott didn't care. He spun bigger visions. 3 months in Europe, baby. Next week Italy, then Spain, then Greece. We're just warming up. On the second weekend, Scott disappeared all night. He said he was meeting an old business contact in Paris. He came home at 4 a.m., drunk, eyes bloodshot. When Julia asked, he snapped, "Don't ask so many questions. I'm handling business." The truth, which Julia only learned later, was that Scott had found an underground casino in Pigalle and lost €5,000 in a single night. In the third week, things started to change. "We need to cut back," Julia said one morning, staring at the banking app. Only $23,000 remained. "We've spent $22,000 in 3 weeks. Scott waved her off. "You worry too much. We've still got 2.5 months. We'll be fine." But they were not fine. That very day, while Scott went to meet another business friend, the worst happened. Julia was sitting in a small cafe near Notre Dame, sipping a café au lait, watching people pass by. Suddenly, her phone rang. An unfamiliar number with a Denver area code. "Hello, I need to speak to Julia Adams Preston," a man said in English. "Yes, this is she. Who's calling?" "This is Detective Rodriguez, Denver Police Department, calling about Scott Preston." "Are you his wife?" "Yes. What's going on?" "Are you aware your husband is wanted for fraud?" Julia's world spun. Scott had conned 3 people in Denver, borrowing money for a can't-miss real estate project, then vanishing. Total, $85,000. They had reported him. A warrant had been issued. "If you know where he is, I advise you to cooperate," the detective said. Julia dropped the phone. It clattered on the table. People turned to look. But she didn't see anyone. Only the truth slowly coming into focus. She had married a con man. That evening, Scott returned at 7. Julia confronted him. For the first time, Scott couldn't deny it. All right, he put up his hands. I owe a little. But it's just a misunderstanding. I'll pay it back. I've got a plan. What plan? Julia shouted, tears spilling over. You lied to me. You've been lying this whole time. You think you're so righteous? Scott snapped back, vicious. What did you do to your mother? You sold her house, sold your dead father's truck, took the money, and partied. Don't play saint. Those words stabbed Julia like a knife. Because they were true. Scott was right. She had done something horrible to me. That night, they said nothing more. Julia lay on the small bed, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time truly understood what she had done. If you had to face the truth that you'd hurt the person closest to you, would you call to apologize or stay silent one more night? The following week, Scott vanished. He said he was going to Nice to meet someone who could lend him money. He promised he'd be back in 3 days. 3 days passed. No news. Julia called. No answer. Texted. No reply. Emailed. Silence. On the 5th day, Julia got a call from the Nice police. Scott had been arrested while trying to swindle a wealthy woman in Monaco. The French police were holding him, investigating, and might extradite him to the U.S. Do you wish to come to the station? The officer asked in accented English. No, Julia said. She didn't want to see Scott again. And now Julia was completely alone in Paris, in a studio whose rent was about to come due, with $11,000 left in her account. No French, no friends, no one. That night Julia sat on the tiny balcony, looking down at Montmartre's light-soaked streets. She heard laughter from the restaurant below, saw couples strolling hand in hand, saw a mother cuddling her baby and humming a lullaby. And Julia felt homesick. Not for the penthouse in Denver, not for the lavish parties. She missed the old Victorian house, the wooden kitchen table, the smell of the coffee Leonard brewed every morning, the way I always laid a clean tablecloth even for a simple meal. She missed me, the mother she had betrayed. Julia picked up her phone and stared at Mom in her contacts. Her finger trembled over the call button, but she couldn't press it, because she knew what she had done, and she didn't know how to apologize in any way that would be enough. The next week was the worst of Julia's life. The rent came due. The landlady, a stern-faced Frenchwoman with silver hair, knocked every day. Lawyer! Lawyer! Rent! Rent! Julia had to pay another 2,000 euros for 2 more weeks. She now had only $8,500 left. She needed a job. But in Paris, with no French, it was nearly impossible. Julia combed Montmartre, dropping off resumes at every shop, restaurant, and cafe. Most shook their heads the moment they heard English. Non, non. Désolé, one small cafe finally offered a tryout, one morning, unpaid, just to see if you can handle it. The work, waiting tables and washing dishes. On the first day, Julia tied on an apron and carried her first tray. 4 coffees, 2 croissants, heavier than she'd imagined. Her hands shook. She walked carefully through the packed tables. Then she caught on a chair leg. The tray fell. Porcelain shattered with a crash. Coffee splashed across the floor. The whole cafe turned to look. The owner, a stout Frenchman with a bushy mustache, barked a string of French Julia couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. "You're useless!" Julia dropped to her knees to gather the shards, tears flooding her eyes. Some customers looked with disdain. Others murmured to their companions in French. She didn't know the words, but she knew the meaning. Just then, a soft English voice with a hint of French lilt. "Don't cry, dear. Everyone has a first day." Julia looked up. An older woman stood there, around 70, silver hair neatly tied back, gentle blue eyes. She wore a simple sweater and a long skirt. "My name is Eileen," she said. "Eileen Roberts. People here call me Madame Eileen. I've lived in Paris for 30 years. Eileen knelt to help pick up the pieces. Just that small gesture, and warmth flooded in. Warmth like a mother's hand. "Do you work here?" Eileen asked. Julia nodded, wiping tears as she cried. "But they'll probably fire me after today." "They might. But if they do, Come find me." Eileen handed her a small slip of paper with a handwritten address. "I run a small boarding house, not fancy, but clean and safe. And I need a helper." The owner stormed over, pointed straight at the door, and growled in French. Julia understood. She was fired. Julia stepped out of the cafe, clutching Eileen's note. Standing on a Parisian street teeming with passers-by, she felt smaller than she ever had. But something else flickered to life. A tiny spark of hope. For the first time since arriving in Paris, someone had been kind to her not because of money, but out of simple kindness. Julia looked down at the paper. The address was 3 miles away. She could take the bus, €2 a ride. But now Julia had learned to count every coin. She decided to walk, and over those 3 miles beneath a cloud-thick Paris sky, Julia thought about her mother, about me, the woman who used to walk miles to save bus fare, about Leonard, who worked double shifts to support the family, about the values she had forgotten. And she began to understand. The journey home, the journey back to herself, had only just begun. Eileen's boarding house sat on a narrow street in the 18th arrondissement, not a tourist area, no Eiffel Tower or museum nearby, just a row of old buildings with rusted iron balconies and the sound of children playing echoing from the courtyard. Julia stood before the door, staring at the faded wooden sign. Maison Eileen, Chambres à louer, House of Eileen, rooms for rent. She took a deep breath and knocked. Eileen opened the door. Still in her sweater and long skirt from that morning, now with a headscarf and a broom in hand. "Ah, the girl from the cafe," Eileen smiled. "I suppose they fired you." Julia nodded, fighting tears. "Yes, ma'am." "You said you needed help?" "That's right. But first, come in and have some tea. You look like you're about to faint." Inside, the house was simple but spotless. The old wooden floors gleamed, white-painted walls were hung with English countryside paintings, and a faint scent of lavender floated in the air. Eileen led Julia to the small kitchen, poured tea, and added a biscuit to the saucer. "Eat, dear. You're too thin. Have you eaten anything today?" Julia suddenly realized she hadn't, only a piece of bread all day. As she bit into the biscuit, tears welled up. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I don't even know why I'm crying. You're tired," Eileen said gently, resting a warm hand on her shoulder. "Tired in body, in mind, and lonely. I can see it in your eyes." Julia told her story. Not everything, but enough. About Scott, his arrest, being stranded in Paris with nowhere to go. She didn't mention me, Veronica, the Aspen house, or the GMC Sierra. Partly out of shame, partly because saying it aloud would mean confronting herself. Eileen listened without interrupting, without judgment. When Julia finished, she simply nodded. "I see. You need a place to stay and some work, don't you?" "Yes, but I don't have much money." "I don't know how much I can pay you." "You can work," Eileen said simply. 6 rooms a day, change sheets, do laundry, make breakfast for guests. In exchange, you stay in the attic room for free and get 2 meals a day. Saturdays and Sundays you work extra, €50 a day. Deal? Julia blinked, stunned. You'll let me stay for free?" "Not free, dear. You'll work hard. I'm not easy to please," Eileen smiled, her eyes still firm. "But I believe in second chances." "Someone once gave me one. Now it's my turn." And so Julia moved into the attic of Maison Eileen, a tiny room with a sloped ceiling, a single bed, a wooden desk, and a window overlooking the Paris rooftops. No air conditioner, no fridge, only the bare essentials. But for the first time since coming to Europe, Julia felt safe. The first morning at 6 a.m., a knock startled her awake. "Up, dear." "Guests want breakfast at 7, Eileen called. Julia stumbled downstairs, eyes blurry. Eileen stood ready in her apron, slicing bread. "Can you make fried eggs?" "I think so." "Good. Make 12. 6 guests, 2 each. Don't break the yolks." The French are very particular about eggs. Julia had never cooked 12 eggs at once. In Denver, she called room service, or Scott drove her to brunch. Now she stood before a huge pan, heart pounding, trying not to drop shells. The first egg, yolk broken. "Discard it." "Start over," Eileen said calmly. The second, she hit too hard. The whites splattered. "Gentle hands, dear. Eggs are like people. Handle them kindly." The third, perfect. Round yolk, clean edge. "Good," Eileen nodded. "See? You can do it." 2 hours later, Julia had learned to slice bread evenly, brew coffee just right, plate food neatly, small things she'd never cared about before. The guests came down, an elderly German couple, a young Japanese traveler, an Italian family with 2 children. "Merci," said the German woman as Julia served. "Grazie," smiled the Italian mother. Those simple thank yous, Julia realized, meant more than all the likes on Instagram. After breakfast, the real work began, cleaning 6 rooms. Change the sheets, vacuum, wipe down tables, scrub bathrooms. Each room spotless, as if no one ever stayed, Eileen instructed. Julia nodded. How hard could it be? Very hard. Tucking corners tight took skill. Streak-free mirrors took patience. Vacuuming under beds meant crawling and stretching. After 2 rooms, her back ached. After 4, her knees went numb. After 6, she sat in the hallway, drenched in sweat, hands trembling. Eileen appeared, offering a glass of lemonade. "Tough work, isn't it?" Julia nodded, too tired to speak. "What does your mother do, if you don't mind me asking?" "My mother, she's a homemaker. Before that, she worked many jobs. Waitress, cleaner, laundress." "Ah," Eileen nodded softly. "Have you ever thought about what she had to do every day?" Julia stayed silent. She never had. She'd always taken it for granted. "This job teaches one thing," Eileen said gently but firmly. "Everything has value. Every clean room, every hot meal, every folded sheet, all are someone's effort. Once you understand that, you'll never take anything lightly again. If you could start over, would you choose comfort or begin again with calloused hands?" The following weeks passed in a rhythm Julia had never known. Waking at 6, making breakfast, cleaning rooms, washing linens, polishing windows, cooking dinner, collapsing into bed by 10. No more Instagram, no more luxury dreams, just work, day after day. But slowly, Julia changed. Her once soft hands, manicured with expensive polish, grew calloused. Her once pampered skin turned sun-kissed and rough. And in her eyes appeared something new, clarity, understanding. One evening, after cleaning the kitchen, Julia sat with Eileen on the small balcony, watching the sun set behind the Paris rooftops. "Madame Eileen," Julia said softly, "can I ask you something?" "Go ahead, dear." "Why did you help me?" "You don't know who I am. I could be a liar, a thief." Eileen paused, gazing toward the horizon. 30 years ago, I came to Paris just like you," she began. "I was British, married a man I thought loved me. He promised a life of luxury, big house, fine car, parties. I believed him. Julia listened, heart racing. Turned out he had a wife in London. I was the mistress, without knowing it. When I confronted him, he threw me out with nothing but my clothes. No money, nowhere to go." "So, what did you do?" "I wandered for 3 days, hungry, cold, terrified. Then an older woman saw me sleeping on a park bench. She took me home, fed me, gave me shelter, and said, 'You have 2 choices, resentment or learning. Choose.' I chose learning. I worked for her 5 years, learned French, learned to run a guest house, learned to live on my own. When she passed, she left me a small inheritance. I used it to buy this house. And now you're doing the same for me, Julia whispered. Yes, because in you, I see myself 30 years ago. Lost, but not hopeless. A girl who can change, if someone gives her a chance. Julia's tears fell. You think I can change? I know you can. You already have. You don't cry over blisters. You don't complain about early mornings. You're learning. That night, lying in her small attic bed, Julia thought of Eileen's words, and for the first time, she thought of me not with vague guilt, but with true understanding. I had done all these things, cleaned rooms, washed linens, cooked meals, not for a year, not for 5, but for a lifetime. And I did them not for myself, but for my family, for Julia. And Julia had repaid me by selling our memories to travel with a con man. By the second month, Julia began saving. Every weekend, she earned 50 euros. She bought only what was necessary, cheap shampoo instead of the organic kind, day-old bread from the discount bakery, walking instead of taking the bus. She tracked every euro in a small notebook Eileen gave her. When you know where your money goes, Eileen said, you'll never run out of it. One day, a young woman came looking for a room. Sophie, a 19-year-old French girl who had run away from home because her parents disapproved of her boyfriend. Sophie had no money, crying right there on the doorstep, begging Eileen to let her stay one night. Eileen turned to Julia. What do you think? You're asking me? You've been here 2 months. You know how hard running this place is. Should we let her stay? Julia looked at Sophie, trembling, lost, nowhere to go, and saw herself 2 months earlier. Let her stay, Julia said. Let her work for her room, like you did for me. Eileen smiled. Very good, dear. You've learned the most important lesson. What lesson? Compassion isn't giving when you have plenty. Compassion is sharing, even when you have little. Julia taught Sophie the way Eileen had taught her. How to cook eggs without breaking yolks, how to fold sheets tight, how to leave a room spotless. And while teaching, Julia realized something. She was no longer the same woman who stepped off that plane 2 months ago. The selfish, shallow Julia who only cared about pleasure. She was gone. A new Julia had been born from sweat, tears, and lessons learned. That night, Julia did what she feared most. She opened her contacts and looked at Mom. Her finger trembled on the screen. She typed, erased, typed again, erased. Finally, she wrote, Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know I'm learning to become the person you and Dad wanted me to be. I love you. She hit send before she could change her mind. Then she sat there, staring at the screen, heart pounding. 1 minute, 2, 5. No reply. Julia set the phone down, tears streaming. Maybe it was too late. Maybe I would never forgive her, but at least she had tried, and that was the first step. While Julia was sending her apology from Paris, I sat in the living room in Denver, holding my phone, watching the screen light up with a notification. Mom, I'm sorry. I read each word, every one like a needle pricking straight into my heart. My finger hovered over the reply button. I wanted to type, Honey, I'm still here. I still love you. Come home. But I didn't. I set the phone face down on the table, stood up, and went to the kitchen to make tea. My hand trembled as I poured the boiling water, not from weakness, but from holding back a mother's instinct, to rush to save her child, even when that child has done wrong. I carried the cup out to the back porch and sat in the rocking chair Leonard had built 20 years ago. The Denver night was cold, wind blowing in from the Rockies carrying the scent of distant snow. Leonard, I whispered into the darkness. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. Our girl is hurting, and I'm acting as if I haven't seen her message. The wind picked up, as if you were answering me. I closed my eyes and remembered the line from your letter. Don't spoil our child, Veronica. Love must sometimes be firm, but firmness is so hard, especially when your daughter is halfway around the world, lonely and afraid. I opened my phone and read the message again. I'm learning to become the person you and Dad wanted me to be. That was what mattered. Julia was learning. If I answered right away, if I said I forgive you, she would think it was over, that words alone were enough. But they weren't. Julia needed real change, and change takes time. I set the phone down. I didn't reply, not yet. The next morning, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Marcus Lee, the attorney Leonard had worked with all those years. Good morning, Mrs. Veronica. Marcus, a Chinese-American man of about 50, neatly suited, graying at the temples, nodded politely. I brought your monthly asset report. We sat in the living room. Marcus opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers. The elevation building is operating well. All 42 units are occupied. Net profit this month is $87,000 after maintenance. I nodded, trying to focus. These numbers still didn't feel real to me. $87,000 a month? Leonard had driven a bus his whole life for only a fraction of that. And, Marcus hesitated, looking at me. Your daughter, Julia, is still renting the penthouse on the 22nd floor. I know. Would you like me to inform her who the real owner is? No, I answered at once. Not yet. Marcus regarded me, curious but respectful. You're planning something, aren't you? Leonard used to say you were the smartest person he knew. I think he was right. After Marcus left, the house fell silent again. The elevation. Julia was living there, paying $4,500 in rent each month, money that ultimately came back to me, without having any idea. Part of me wanted to laugh, part of me wanted to cry, but most of all, I wanted to know, how would Julia react when she learned the truth? The phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I hesitated, then picked up. Hello, may I speak with Mrs. Veronica Adams? Yes, this is she. This is Nolan Pierce, building manager at the elevation. I'm calling about Penthouse 201. My heart sped up. That was Julia's unit. What's the matter? The tenants, Julia and Scott Preston, didn't pay this month's rent. When I called, only Mrs. Julia answered. She said her husband has been arrested in France, and she's in Paris and can't come back to make the payment. I stayed silent, sorting the information. Per policy, after 30 days we'll proceed with eviction. But since you're the owner, I wanted to ask your preference first. Give her more time. How long, ma'am? 2 months. And don't tell her that I intervened. Yes, Mrs. Adams, I understand. When I hung up, I realized my hands were shaking. Julia couldn't pay the rent. Perhaps Scott had taken everything. Perhaps she really was struggling. I could end it all right now. I could call Julia and say, "Come home, I'll take care of you." But that wouldn't teach her anything. Leonard didn't spend 40 years building this to have me serve it up on a silver platter. He did it to make sure our daughter could stand on her own, with a safety net only when she truly needed it. Right now, Julia was learning to stand. I couldn't interrupt that process. Will you forgive the moment the apology arrives, or wait until actions prove it? The following week, I received another call, this time from Sophia Herrera, a financial advisor at Mountain View Trust. Mrs. Adams, I need to verify a transaction. Someone claiming to be your daughter just attempted to withdraw funds from your linked account. Ice ran through my veins. My daughter? Julia? Not exactly. A man named Scott Preston. He said he's your son-in-law and needs emergency funds. Where is he? I thought he was under arrest in France. He called from a French number, said he needed $20,000 for a lawyer and that his wife, Julia, had authorized it. Rage flared. Scott, even in custody, was still trying to swindle my family. Don't give him a cent, I said, my voice like ice. If he calls again, inform me immediately. Of course, Mrs. Adams. And rest assured, we haven't disclosed any account information. After I hung up, I sat still, feeling both contempt for Scott and worry for Julia. Did she know he was trying to con my family? Or was she just a victim, too? I wanted to believe Julia didn't know. I wanted to believe that, though lost, she hadn't become complicit. That evening, I pulled an old photo box from the closet. Julia at 5, grinning with 2 front teeth missing. Julia at 10, in a baseball uniform, muddy from head to toe. Julia at 16, prom night, in the blue dress I sewed myself. Where was that little girl? When did she lose her innocence and kindness? I knew the answer. She hadn't lost them. They were only hidden by greed, by Scott's influence, by a counterfeit material world. Beneath it all, my Julia was still there, and I would wait until she found her own way back. One afternoon at the market, I ran into Karen, our next-door neighbor of 30 years. "Veronica, it's been too long. How are you?" "I'm all right, thank you." "How's Julia?" "I heard she went to Europe." "Wonderful!" I forced a smile. "Yes, she's there now." "She's lucky to have a mother like you." "You must miss her terribly?" Tears sprang up without warning. I couldn't hold back. "Karen, let me be honest. I'm not a good mother. I'm letting my daughter learn a very hard lesson. Some nights I ask myself if I'm doing the right thing." Karen took my hand, eyes full of understanding. "My son was like that once. He had gambling debts, begged us to rescue him. I wanted to so badly. But my husband said, if we save him this time, he'll never learn. It's hard, Veronica, but sometimes love has to be strict." We hugged in the supermarket aisle, 2 mothers trying to do the right thing even when it hurts. Back home, I checked my phone. No new messages from Julia. Since last week's apology, silence. What was she doing? Was she okay? Did she have enough to eat? I reminded myself, trust the process, Veronica. Leonard trusted you. Now you must trust Julia. That night before bed, I did what I had done since Leonard passed. I spoke to him. "Leonard, today I almost called our girl. I reread her message for the 100th time. She wrote, 'I'm learning. Do you see it? Our child is learning.' I rested my hand on Leonard's pillow. But I'm so afraid. Afraid I'm too harsh. Afraid she'll never forgive me. Afraid that when she comes back, she won't want to look at me." Outside, the wind moved through the trees, whispering like a voice. In my dream that night, I saw Leonard smile, his warm hand on my cheek. "You're doing the right thing, my love. Have faith." I woke with tears still on my face, but my heart lighter. I would keep waiting, and when Julia was ready, not when she was desperate, but when she had truly changed, I would be there. Because true love is not snatching a child away from consequences, but giving her the space to grow. 3 months after Julia left Denver, I received a call from Denver International Airport. "Mom, I'm at the airport." Julia's voice was hoarse and tired, but something was different. No arrogance, no pride, only weariness and humility. I gripped the phone, my heart pounding like a drum. You're in Denver?" "Yes, I just landed. Could you pick me up? I know I don't deserve to ask, but I'll come. Wait for me at the international arrivals pickup." I hung up, my hands trembling. 3 months. 3 months of silence, except for the apology text I hadn't answered. And now, Julia was back. I took the keys. This time, not the bus. After Marcus Lee explained the assets, I bought an old Honda Accord, simple, unshowy. I drove to the airport. With every mile, my heart beat harder. My daughter was home. But was she still the same Julia? At the pickup area, I almost didn't recognize her. Julia stood there with an old backpack, wearing faded jeans and a thin sweater. No luxury suitcase, No designer labels, hair tied back, no makeup, sun-darkened skin. But the greatest change was in her eyes. No longer vacant or cold, tired, yet clear and mature. "Mom," Julia called, her voice catching. She didn't run into my arms, just stood there, as if she didn't dare. I walked up, looked at my daughter, the woman who 3 months earlier had sold our family memories to travel. And before me, that person was gone. "You've lost weight," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm sorry, Mom." Julia burst into tears. "I'm sorry for everything." I don't know what to say except I'm sorry. I opened my arms. Julia sobbed in her mother's embrace like a child waking from a nightmare. "Let's go home," I whispered. "Let's go home." On the drive back, Julia told me everything. Not in one breath, but in fragments, as if each confession hurt. She told me about Scott's arrest, about being alone in Paris, about Maison Eileen, about Eileen, who taught her the true meaning of work. "Mom, I cleaned rooms, washed dishes, laundered sheets," Julia said, her voice tight. "And for the first time in my life, I understood what you did for me. All those years you worked and sacrificed, and I took it for granted." I drove listening, not interrupting, letting her say all she needed to say. "Madam Eileen told me something I'll never forget. You don't know the value of something until you have to work for it. Mom, my whole life I never had to work for anything. You and Dad gave me everything and I wasted it." At a red light, I turned to her. "What did you learn from Paris?" Julia went quiet, looking out the window toward the familiar Rockies. "I learned that love isn't giving me what I want. It's teaching me to become who I need to be. And that's what you did. When I called you, crying for help, you didn't answer. At first I was angry, thought you'd abandoned me." Tears flowed again. "But now I understand. If you'd saved me then, I'd never have learned. I'd still be the old Julia. Selfish, shallow. You let me fall so I could learn to get up. That's the greatest love anyone could give me." The light turned green. I started driving, my eyes already wet. "If given a chance to make things right, would you rather be forgiven immediately or be given the space to grow?" Back home, Julia walked in like a lost child who'd found the way. She touched everything: the kitchen table, the rocking chair, the framed photos on the wall. "I missed home so much," she whispered. "I missed the morning coffee smell. I missed the creak of the stairs. I missed everything." We sat at the kitchen table, the very one Leonard used for his last breakfast. I made tea. "Mom, I have to say this." Julia gripped the cup. "I don't have money to pay for the penthouse." I called the manager to ask for more time, but they'll probably evict me soon. I'm thinking of finding somewhere else, maybe a small apartment, if I can ask the building manager to switch units. I sipped my tea and looked at her. "Do you know who owns the elevation?" Julia shook her head. "No, I only know it's some company, Summit Ridge Capital. Why do you ask?" It was time to tell the truth. "Honey, there's something I have to tell you about your father. About what he did for 40 years that neither you nor I knew." I stood, took the yellow envelope, now with the documents photocopied, and set it before Julia. "Read!" Julia opened the envelope, hands shaking. She read Leonard's letter, her eyes widening. "Mom, this? Dad wrote this? He invested? Assets?" "Read it all, dear," Julia read on. When she reached the part about 7 properties and the $4.2 million, she stopped, looking up at me in disbelief. "Mom, you're rich?" "We're rich?" "Your father was rich," I corrected her. He worked his whole life, not just to support the family, but to build a future. He kept it secret because he wanted you to love us for who we are, not for what we have. Julia looked at the papers, then at me, then back down. Summit Ridge Capital, that's Dad's company? And you're the owner? Yes. The elevation belongs to me, belongs to us. Julia jumped up, pacing, hands on her head. I don't understand. When I sold the Aspen Houses things, when I sold the GMC Sierra, you could have stopped me. You could have told me the truth. Why didn't you? I put a hand on her shoulder. Because if I had told you then, you wouldn't have learned anything. You'd think, Mom's rich, so I don't have to worry. You'd keep living selfishly and shallowly. You'd never understand the value of work, of sacrifice, of love. Julia turned back, her face wet. But you knew I was suffering in Paris. You read my message, didn't you? The text I sent from Paris. I read it. I nodded, tears falling. I read it hundreds of times, and every night I had to sit on my hands not to call, not to wire money, not to fly out to bring you home. Why? Why didn't you save me? Because I love you, Julia. I love you enough to do what's right, not what's easy. If I saved you too soon, you wouldn't grow. You'd remain a dependent child. Julia collapsed to the floor, hugging her knees, sobbing. I'm sorry. I sold our family's memories. I sold Dad's beloved truck. I treated you so badly, and still, you loved me enough to teach me this lesson. I sat beside her, holding her like I did long ago. Honey, I've always loved you, even when you were at your worst. But love doesn't mean overlooking every mistake. Love means helping you become the best version of yourself. We sat on the kitchen floor, holding each other and crying. Not out of sorrow, but out of redemption, forgiveness, and a love that had been tested and still stood firm. After a while, Julia wiped her tears and looked at me seriously. Mom, I want to say this. I don't want your money. I froze. What did you say? I don't want money. I don't want the penthouse. I don't want luxury anymore. 3 months in Paris taught me I don't need those things to be happy. I need purpose. I need to feel I'm doing something meaningful. What do you want to do? Julia took a deep breath. In Paris, Madame Eileen introduced me to an organization supporting women facing domestic violence. I volunteered there, and for the first time I felt I could do something important. I want to study social work. I want to help others, the way Eileen helped me. I looked at my daughter. The woman before me was no longer the arrogant Julia from 3 months ago. This was a new Julia, purposeful, compassionate. I think that's wonderful, I said, and I'll support you. Not by handing you money, but by helping you reach your goals. I want to work. I want to earn money with my own hands. Mom, could you hire me? Building management, anything. I don't want special treatment. I just want the chance to prove I've changed. I thought, then nodded. All right, but you'll start from the bottom. You'll be an assistant to Nolan Pierce, the manager at the elevation. You'll learn building operations from the ground up. Agreed? Agreed, Julia answered immediately. Thank you, Mom. Thank you for a second chance. It's not a second chance, dear girl. This is a new life, a life you'll build with your own hands. That night, Julia slept in her old room, still just as it was the day she left. I sat by her bed, stroking her hair like when she was little. Mom, Julia murmured drowsily, can I ask you something? Go ahead. Did you ever want to give up? Did you ever think I couldn't be saved? I paused, choosing my words. There were nights I couldn't sleep, wondering if I was doing the right thing. Many times I picked up the phone to call you, but each time I remembered your father's words, don't spoil our child, and I knew I had to stay firm. Dad was amazing, Julia whispered. I wish I had told him more often that I loved him. He knew, sweetheart. He always knew, and now he's looking down, proud of his daughter. Julia smiled and drifted to sleep. I sat there, looking at the child who had lost her way and found it again, and felt my heart brim over. Leonard was right. Love must sometimes be firm. But when done rightly, it has the power to change a life. That night, for the first time since Leonard died, I slept peacefully, knowing that I, Julia, and Leonard, were, at last, all right. On her first morning of work, Julia woke at 5:30. I heard the sound of running water in the bathroom, cabinet doors opening and closing. By 6 o'clock, when I went downstairs, she was already at the table. Black slacks, plain white shirt, hair tied neatly back, a cup of coffee, and a notebook filled with dense handwriting in front of her. "You're up early," I said. "I want to get to the office before Mr. Nolan to prepare," Julia explained. "He's known to be strict. I don't want to leave a bad impression on my first day." I smiled, pouring myself coffee. My Julia, the girl who used to sleep until 11, who'd complain about getting up before 9, now woke before dawn on her own. "I'm proud of you," I said. Julia looked up, eyes a little red. "I haven't done anything yet, Mom. You've already done the most important thing, decided to change, and stayed committed to it. That's all I ever wanted." The management office of the elevation was on the ground floor. Nolan Pierce, a tall black man in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with a deep, calm voice, stood before the scheduling board when Julia entered. "You're Julia?" he asked, not smiling, but not cold either. "The owner told me." "You want to learn the job from the ground up?" "Yes, sir," Julia answered respectfully. "I'm ready to do whatever is needed." Nolan eyed her up and down, assessing. "Whatever is needed is a big promise. This job isn't easy. 42 apartments mean 42 families, 42 problems a day. I need people who solve problems, not add to them. Got it?" "Yes, sir." "Good. 3 things today: leaky faucet in 804, clogged toilet in 1205, AC failure in 1507. Go with the maintenance crew, take notes, learn how the system works. We start at 8. Any questions?" "No, sir." Nolan's tone softened slightly. "Julia, I know you're the owner's daughter. But here, you're just another trainee, no privileges. Do well, you'll be recognized. Do poorly, you're out. Clear?" "Clear, and thank you, sir, for saying that." For the first 3 days, Julia followed the technicians everywhere, tightening screws, checking leaks, resetting air conditioning panels, the sort of things she used to summon others to do. On the 4th day, Mrs. Williams from the 6th floor, an 80-year-old widow, called the front desk, furious about noise from the apartment above. "Tell them to shut up. They've been loud all night," she shouted over the phone. Nolan handed Julia the address of 704. "Your first communication test. Go handle it." Julia went upstairs, heart pounding, and knocked. A man in his 30s opened the door, holding a 6-month-old baby who was wailing loudly. "Sorry?" Julia said gently. "I'm Julia from management. We've received a complaint about noise." "Noise?" The man sighed. "My baby's got a fever. He's been crying all night. My wife's on the night shift. I'm doing my best." Julia saw the dark circles under his eyes, the wrinkled shirt, the exhaustion, and she remembered the struggling families she'd met in Paris. "What's the baby's temperature?" "About 101.3. I gave him medicine, but it hasn't gone down." "Have you tried a warm compress? Or keeping the room ventilated?" He shook his head. "I'm a new dad. I don't know." Julia remembered what Eileen had taught her about caring for sick children at the boarding house. "Wait here." She ran downstairs to the first aid room, grabbed a cool towel, and came back. "Here, gently press this on his forehead. Open the window just a little for air. If the fever doesn't drop in 2 hours, take him to the doctor." The man looked at her, eyes wet. "Thank you. Really, thank you." "As for the noise," Julia added softly, "I'll explain to Mrs. Williams. Don't worry downstairs." She calmly reported the situation and suggested, Would you like me to check the sound insulation between the two units? We might need to improve it. Mrs. Williams paused, then nodded. You're a good girl. Not like most young people today. Go ahead. When Julia reported back, Nolan nodded approvingly. You handled that well. You didn't just stop the complaint. You solved the real problem. Good job. That was the first compliment Julia received from Nolan, and it was worth more than 1,000 empty praises online. What will you do when the past screams behind you and the future demands you grow up today? By the second month, Julia enrolled in a social work program at Metropolitan State University of Denver. She worked 8 to 5, then attended evening classes. I watched her change day by day. She grew thinner but stronger, her eyes tired but bright with purpose, her hands calloused, and that became her badge of honor. One night, after finals, she came home late and collapsed onto the couch, resting her head on my lap. Mom, I'm so tired. Sometimes I wonder if I'm pushing myself too hard. Do you want to take a break? No, Julia answered immediately. I don't want to stop. I just need to know I'm on the right path. I told her, when your father and I first married, we had love and debt. He worked 2 shifts. I worked 3 jobs. Some nights I cried from exhaustion, but still woke up early the next day. Do you know why? Why, Mom? Because I knew I was working for something bigger than myself. To build a family. A future for you. Purpose gives strength. Julia sat up, looking at me. I feel the same. I want to help people, the way Madame Eileen helped me. I want to be someone, Dad, and you can be proud of. My dear, we already are. Not because of what you do, but because you chose the right path after being lost. That's the hardest thing. 3 months later, Nolan promoted Julia to assistant building manager. Not because she was the owner's daughter, but because she'd earned it. When she got the news, she didn't call me first. She went straight to the cemetery, to Leonard's grave. Later, when I visited, I saw a fresh bouquet and a note. Dear Dad, I did it. I finally became the person you wanted me to be. I love you. Julia. That evening, we had dinner at home. Nothing fancy, just my cooking. Julia rolled up her sleeves, washed vegetables, sliced meat. Things she'd learned in Paris. Mom, I have an idea. What idea? The vacation house in Aspen, the one I thought I'd sold. I want to turn it into a temporary shelter for women and children escaping domestic violence. They can stay there while rebuilding their lives. I can manage it through my program. What do you think? I set down my fork, looking at the daughter who once thought only of herself and now thought of others. That's the best idea I've ever heard. Your father would love it. Really? Really? That house was built with love. Now it'll spread love. Nothing could be more fitting. Julia came around the table and hugged me tight. Thank you, Mom. Thank you for not giving up on me, for loving me enough to teach me the hardest lesson. 6 months later, the Leonard house opened in Aspen. Julia worked tirelessly to renovate it. Warm-colored walls, tidy beds, a stocked kitchen, a playroom for children. A safe, welcoming place. It was a beautiful autumn afternoon. About 50 people attended, social workers, volunteers, donors, locals. The first person to walk through the door was none other than Eileen Roberts. Julia had flown her in from Paris. They embraced for a long time, both crying. You did it, Julia, Eileen said, voice trembling. You took what you learned and turned it into giving. That's what life is about. You taught me that, Julia said, holding her hands. Without you, I don't know where I'd be. Eileen looked around the house. The warm walls, the neatly made beds, the lively kitchen, the children's laughter. This home will save so many, just as it once saved you. During her speech, Julia stood before the crowd, hands shaking around the microphone. 6 months ago, I was a different person. I thought happiness came from money and things. I was wrong. I had to lose everything to understand. What matters most isn't what we have, but what we give. This house bears my father's name, Leonard Adams, a man who worked his whole life not to be rich, but to give his family a future. He taught me, even if not directly, that true love sometimes has to be firm, to let those you love fall so they can learn to stand. My mother, Veronica Adams, lived that lesson. She was strong enough not to save me when I thought I needed saving most, because she knew it wasn't yet time. Today, I stand here not because someone rescued me, but because I learned to rescue myself. The Leonard House will be a place where women and children in their hardest moments can find safety, support, and, most importantly, learn to save themselves. Because that is real strength. Applause erupted. I stood, clapping for my daughter, not just for her words, but for the transformation I had witnessed. After the ceremony, we stood together on the porch, gazing at the snowy ridges in the distance. "Your father's watching and smiling," I said softly. "I hope so," Julia replied. "I hope he's proud of me." "He always has been, Julia, even when you were lost, because he knew you'd find your way home, and you did." We stood there quietly, two women who had walked through pain, but arrived somewhere better. The journey wasn't over, but Julia now knew the way, and that's all a mother could ever hope for. If you enjoyed this story, tell me where you're listening from. And tell me, would you be able to do what Veronica did? To let someone you love struggle so they could truly grow? Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss more true, heartfelt stories. And if you'd like to support the channel, send a super thanks. It helps me keep bringing more meaningful stories to life. See you in the next story. Sending you love and respect.